Barron Trump stepped off the tarmac, the early morning sun casting long shadows across the expanse of the private airport. It was a calm day, the kind he preferred, quiet, uneventful, with only the hum of engines and the distant murmur of a few workers preparing planes for takeoff. It was a far cry from the constant media frenzy he had been born into, but that was the life he had known. As he walked towards the sleek, private jet awaiting him, Barron could feel the weight of his last name, the expectations that came with it. But today he was just a young man traveling for a few days of solitude. The world, with its constant glare of attention, seemed a little farther away, for now. It wasn't unusual for Barron to fly alone. His schedule, like that of his family, was a well-orchestrated series of movements, each carefully planned to avoid disruption. But today felt different. For once, there was no entourage, no advisors hovering at the edges of his space, no protective walls to keep the outside world at bay. It was just him and the flight. The quiet was a rare gift, one he hadn't taken for granted. Boarding the jet, Barron settled into the plush leather seat, the cabin spacious and tastefully furnished. The crew greeted him warmly, but he barely acknowledged their presence. His mind was elsewhere, focused on the next few hours of isolation. He would have time to think, to read, and to reflect without the constant noise of public life. The soft hum of the engine as the plane began its taxi was a comforting sound, a familiar rhythm he had come to associate with the rare moments of peace in his life. As the plane took off and climbed into the sky, Barron looked out the window. The sprawling city below seemed insignificant, as if it were merely a toy set in a child's room, a reminder of how distant his life sometimes felt from the world below. He had often wondered what it would be like to live as a regular person, someone unburdened by expectations and the eyes of the public. But the Trump name had made that impossible from the start. His family had been under scrutiny for years, their every move watched, analyzed, and criticized. Barron had learned early on to hide in plain sight, to observe from the shadows, never drawing attention to himself. But today, in this small private space high above the world, he could breathe for a moment. He turned to his laptop, pulling up the book he had been meaning to read for weeks but never found the time to start. It was a dense, philosophical work, one that demanded quiet and focus, two things Barron had rarely had in abundance. As he flipped through the pages, he felt the familiar pang of discomfort. It wasn't that he didn't enjoy reading or reflecting, it was the constant interruption of his thoughts by the world around him that made it difficult. His family's fame, his father's politics, his mother's public persona, it all tugged at the edges of his life, like threads that never quite unraveled. Today, he thought, perhaps he could find a moment to reflect without the world pulling at him. As the hours passed, Barron became lost in the words on the page, the calm of the flight enveloping him like a protective cocoon. But there was something else beneath the surface, something Barron couldn't quite shake. He had always been quiet, introspective, even reserved at times. But was that enough? Could he truly escape the weight of his family's legacy by retreating into the comfort of isolation? He had heard the whispers, seen the headlines: Barron Trump, the silent son, the one who never seemed to speak or make his presence known. But what if he didn't want to be known? What if he had no desire to step into the limelight, to become a part of the spectacle that had consumed his family for decades? The thought lingered as the plane cruised at 30,000 feet, the world far below and the weight of his last name pressing gently against him. Barron knew the truth: there would be no escaping it. No matter where he went, no matter how far he traveled, he would always be tied to the Trump name. It was a label that followed him, an inescapable part of his identity. But in these moments, in this isolated space, he could pretend for just a little while that he wasn't defined by it. He could choose to be Barron Trump, the young man, not the son of a former president. The flight continued, and Barron eventually closed the book, leaning back in his seat, eyes closed, letting the rhythm of the plane rock him gently. It was strange, this desire to disappear, and yet, simultaneously, a longing to be seen for who he truly was. The paradox was something he had struggled with for years. But today, on this plane, Barron had an epiphany. Perhaps he didn't need to hide at all. Perhaps he could simply be himself, unburdened by the expectations others had of him. It wouldn't be easy, of course. Nothing in his life had ever been simple. But for the first time, Barron allowed himself the space to think that maybe, just maybe, there was more to his identity than the name he carried. As the plane began its descent, Barron felt a shift within himself. The world he was returning to was filled with noise, expectations, and a constant barrage of opinions. But for now, for this fleeting moment, he had found something rare: clarity. It was a small thing, this moment of peace, but it was his. A new beginning, perhaps. A new way of seeing the world. He didn't need to have all the answers, not today, but he was beginning to understand that it was okay not to have them all figured out. As the plane touched down and the hum of the engines quieted, Barron Trump stepped into the next chapter of his life, one where he might just begin to define himself on his own terms. The hum of the private jet's engines was a constant background noise as Barron Trump settled deeper into his seat. It was a long flight, one that allowed him a rare moment of respite from the ever-watchful eyes of the world. As the miles stretched out beneath him, Barron found himself lost in thought, contemplating his life, his family, and his place in the world. There was a quiet comfort in the anonymity of this moment, a brief escape from the public glare. But that comfort was soon interrupted. As the cabin attendant closed the door and began preparing the flight for takeoff, a voice broke the silence. Barron glanced to his left to see a man, perhaps in his late 30s, dressed in a sharp suit and carrying the air of someone accustomed to wealth and influence. The man's eyes met Barron's briefly, a quick flash of recognition then, without a word, he turned his attention to the magazine in front of him. Barron didn't mind. He preferred it that way, peaceful, unobtrusive, free from unnecessary conversation. But as the plane climbed into the sky and the sounds of the world outside seemed to fade away, the stranger made his move. "So, what brings you aboard this fine plane?" The voice was casual, but it carried an undertone of curiosity that Barron had learned to recognize over the years. It was the tone people often used when they thought they were talking to someone with no story of their own, someone who would simply smile and give a polite answer. Barron glanced at the man. "Business," he said flatly, not offering much else. He wasn't in the mood for small talk. The man smiled, clearly content with the one-word response, and settled back in his seat. "Ah, I see. Always a good idea to keep things low-key. I'm sure you've got plenty of people to handle the details for you," the man continued, leaning back in his seat with a smirk that suggested he had pegged Barron for the type of person who wouldn't want to be bothered with the details. Someone who was perhaps sheltered or accustomed to having people do the work for him. Barron could feel the presumptions stacking up like bricks in the air between them, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a twinge of annoyance. "Maybe," Barron replied curtly, avoiding the stranger's gaze. He wasn't sure why it bothered him. Perhaps it was the way the man seemed to think he had figured him out with a single glance. Barron had spent much of his life being placed into boxes that other people had created for him. The tall, quiet son of a former president. The teenager who was always in the background, rarely seen but always in the spotlight. It was easy for people to make assumptions about him. After all, he carried the Trump name, and that name came with a set of expectations that had little to do with who he actually was. It wasn't a burden Barron carried lightly, but it was one he had learned to manage, even if it sometimes felt like the weight of the world was placed squarely on his shoulders. The man didn't seem to pick up on Barron's lack of interest in the conversation. Instead, he pressed on, his voice now tinged with what could only be described as smugness. "I've got to admit, though, it must be a strange life here. Always in the public eye, never really able to just live your life without someone looking over your shoulder." The man chuckled, clearly feeling self-satisfied with his own observations. Barron felt his jaw tighten. This stranger didn't know him, and yet he felt entitled to pass judgment on his life, on the very essence of who he was. Barron had always been quiet, reserved even, but this moment stirred something deep within him, an irritation, perhaps, at how people thought they could understand him without ever bothering to ask. "Maybe," Barron said, his voice now taking on a sharper edge. "But it's not as simple as it seems." He turned his gaze toward the window, willing the conversation to end, but the stranger didn't take the hint. Instead, he leaned forward, as though his earlier assumptions had only whetted his appetite for more. "Well, I guess you can't blame people for being curious. I mean, your family is kind of a circus, right? The whole world watches your dad, your mum, all of it." The stranger's words were careless, the smile that accompanied them all too eager. Barron's heart rate quickened, and the small but persistent voice in the back of his mind told him that this conversation was headed somewhere uncomfortable. It was always the same. People had a way of turning his family, his life, into something they could understand, something they could make fun of, something they could judge without ever truly seeing him. The stranger had already built his narrative, and Barron was simply a pawn in the larger story. A brief silence followed, but it wasn't the comforting kind. Barron could feel the tension building, the irritation simmering just beneath the surface. He wasn't sure how much longer he could sit there, pretending to be interested in the stranger's assumptions about him and his life. "I don't think you really understand," Barron said, his voice steady but firm. He turned back to the stranger, meeting his gaze for the first time since the conversation began. "People like you think you know everything about my family just because it's in the news. You don't know what it's like. You don't know what it's like to be judged for things you didn't choose, things you didn't even have a say in. So maybe you should be careful about how you talk about me or my family." The stranger blinked, taken aback by Barron's sudden directness. For a moment, Barron felt a flicker of satisfaction. It wasn't often that he spoke out like this, especially when he felt cornered by assumptions. But for some reason, this time was different. The stranger seemed to shrink under Barron's gaze, his confident posture faltering just slightly. Perhaps, Barron thought, people weren't as good at seeing through others as they liked to believe. The man cleared his throat, offering a half-hearted apology, though it didn't seem entirely genuine. Barron simply nodded and returned his attention to the window, the air between them now thick with unspoken words. For the rest of the flight, the conversation didn't return to Barron. He was no longer the object of the stranger's curiosity. Instead, they sat in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. But for Barron, it was a moment of clarity. He didn't have to be defined by anyone else's assumptions, no matter how confident they were. He was more than the story the world had written for him. And for the first time in a long time, Barron felt a spark of pride in that. As the plane cruised at 30,000 feet, the hum of the engines became a steady rhythm, blending into the background as Barron Trump gazed out of the window. The clouds stretched out like an endless sea of white and blue, the horizon a thin, distant line. It was peaceful in the sky, a rare calm amidst the chaos of his daily life. But the calm was soon disrupted by the voice of the businessman seated beside him. The man, in his mid-40s with a well-tailored suit and a slightly too forceful smile, had been speaking to Barron off and on for the past half hour. At first, Barron had been content to nod politely, offering brief responses when necessary. He wasn't in the mood for conversation, especially not with a stranger, but the man was insistent. His voice, though charming, carried an air of superiority. There was an undertone of someone who had seen success, someone who believed his opinions mattered more than others. "So, what's your take on the state of tech these days?" the man asked, leaning back in his seat as he adjusted the cuffs of his shirt. His tone was casual, as if he had already decided that Barron's answer would align with his own views. "Seems like it's all about these startups now, tech billionaires making waves, changing the world. But honestly, a lot of it is just hype, don't you think?" Barron didn't respond immediately. The question itself wasn't surprising. He had heard similar sentiments before. People loved to critique the tech industry, especially those who thought they understood it from a distance. They often overlooked the work, the complexity, and the innovation involved, focusing instead on the headlines and the controversies. Barron had heard plenty of such comments, especially given his family's involvement in tech and business. But today, in this quiet moment, something about the man's dismissive tone rubbed Barron the wrong way. The business world might be messy, but it was also full of creativity, risk, and ambition, the very qualities that had led Barron's family to success. To reduce it all to hype felt unfair, like dismissing something he cared about as nothing more than smoke and mirrors. "I think it's a little more complex than that," Barron said, his voice steady but calm. "Tech is more than just flashy startups or billionaires getting press. It's about innovation, pushing boundaries, and creating something that can change lives. Sure, there are failures along the way, but that's how progress happens." The businessman chuckled, but there was a hint of condescension in his laugh. "Innovation, huh? Well, I guess you could say that about a lot of things. But at the end of the day, it's all about the money, isn't it? Tech is just another game for rich people to play. They get rich, then they sell their companies or go public, and everyone walks away with a big check. It's about ego, not progress." Barron felt his jaw tighten slightly. This wasn't the first time he'd heard someone reduce everything to a question of wealth and ego. People often assumed that his family's success, and by extension his own potential, was purely about money and power. But Barron knew better. He had seen the sacrifices, the long hours, the dedication to building something more meaningful than just financial success. His father, for all his brashness, had built companies that had made real impacts. Tesla, SpaceX, these weren't just games for rich people. They were bold, risky ventures that had pushed the boundaries of technology and space exploration. It's not just about money, Barron said, his voice low but firm. It's about doing something that matters. You can't build something great if your only goal is profit. The businessman's smile faltered for a brief moment, but he quickly recovered, his eyes narrowing slightly as he leaned in closer. You sound just like one of those Silicon Valley types, all idealistic and dream big. But I've been in this game long enough to know the truth. It's about power. The money comes first, then the rest follows. All this talk about making the world a better place is just fluff. Barron, if you really want to succeed, you have to think about your bottom line. Barron's gaze didn't waver. He had heard these arguments before, from executives who seemed to think they had cracked the code to success. They thought that business was a game of numbers, a series of moves to secure their position at the top. But Barron knew that real success, the kind that left a legacy, was about vision, about seeing the bigger picture. His family's wealth wasn't just the result of shrewd financial decisions, it was also about creating something lasting. His father hadn't just built a business empire, he had inspired a movement, a drive toward space exploration, clean energy, and artificial intelligence. I don't think you understand, Barron said, his voice growing more confident. It's not about playing games or thinking about power. It's about seeing the future and building it. People who only care about the bottom line are the ones who'll be left behind. The businessman's smile had completely disappeared by now. Barron could see the subtle shift in his demeanor. This wasn't going as the man had expected. He had assumed that Barron, the quiet young man seated next to him, would be another mindless follower of the money-first philosophy. Instead, Barron had spoken with a clarity that the businessman hadn't anticipated, and it clearly made him uncomfortable. "Look," the businessman said, leaning back in his seat again, his tone now defensive. "I'm just telling you how the world works. You can keep dreaming if you want, but reality is something else. You'll see it when you get older." Barron didn't respond immediately. He wasn't interested in arguing with someone who was so convinced of his own limited view of the world. Instead, he turned his attention back to the window, the clouds outside now taking on a soft, golden hue as the sun began to dip lower in the sky. He realized that this conversation, like so many others, wasn't about convincing anyone else. It was about asserting his own truth, his own understanding of what mattered. And though the businessman might never see it, Barron knew that his path was one that would be shaped by something far more meaningful than money. The conversation had taken a turn, one that Barron Trump had not expected but was beginning to understand in a deeper way. The businessman beside him had become more insistent, more dismissive of his views. Barron could feel the man's growing irritation, but what struck him most was the sheer lack of self-awareness. The man was so locked into his own narrative of success that he couldn't even fathom a different perspective. It was a display of arrogance, and Barron, for the first time in the conversation, felt an urge to challenge it not just with his words, but with his presence. The businessman, leaning back in his seat with a self-satisfied smirk, clearly believed he had the upper hand. Barron had been polite, perhaps too polite, at first, allowing the man to rattle off his tired philosophies about power and money. But now Barron's silence had taken on a different tone. He wasn't just listening anymore, he was watching, carefully observing how the man spoke, how he framed every point, how he dismissed Barron's opinions. The businessman's arrogance was thickening, but Barron saw it for what it was, a defense mechanism. The more Barron listened, the more he understood the fragile ego beneath the bravado. "Listen, the businessman continued, his tone condescending. "It's not about being idealistic. You can talk about vision and change all you want, but in the end, the world is run by power. People in Silicon Valley, they like to talk about saving the world. But the real truth is that they want to control it. They want to be the ones at the top, making the rules." Barron let the words hang in the air for a moment, weighing them against his own understanding. This man spoke of power as though it were the ultimate goal, as though it was the only thing that mattered. But Barron saw power differently. To him, true power wasn't just about controlling others or acquiring wealth, it was about influence, the kind of influence that came from doing something truly remarkable. He thought about his father, how he had built companies that changed entire industries. He thought about SpaceX, Tesla, and the incredible vision they carried. It wasn't about money or control, it was about inspiring others, about leading with purpose and passion. "Is that how you see it?" Barron asked, his voice calm but piercing. The question wasn't rhetorical, it was an invitation, a challenge to rethink everything the businessman had just said. "You really think power is about control? You really believe that the only thing that drives success is the need to be on top?" The businessman, not expecting Barron to turn the tables so quickly, paused, his eyes narrowed, his smirk faltering. "Of course it is," he said, as though it was a simple fact. "Look at the world. Everything's about who controls what, who has the most power." Barron shook his head slowly. "You're missing something important," he said. His words were measured, deliberate. "Power isn't just about control. True power comes from making a difference. It's about inspiring others, creating something that leaves a mark on the world. And sometimes that means putting others first, not yourself." The businessman's face twitched, a mixture of surprise and irritation creeping in. He clearly wasn't accustomed to being questioned in this way. Barron's calm, assured tone seemed to catch him off guard. The man had assumed Barron was just another privileged kid, easily impressed by his own opinions, but Barron wasn't playing that game. He had learned, over the years, how to see through the facade of wealth and success. His family's legacy wasn't built on dominating others, it was built on pushing boundaries and changing the world. Barron knew that. The businessman clearly didn't. "I think you misunderstand," Barron continued. "True success isn't just about being at the top. It's about what you do with your position when you get there. If all you're doing is hoarding power, then you're just a ruler, not a leader." The businessman's expression flickered, something shifting in his eyes. He didn't respond immediately. Barron could feel the tension building in the air between them. The dynamic had shifted in an instant. The quiet, reserved young man sitting next to him was no longer a passive listener. He had become a force in the conversation, one that was challenging everything the businessman believed. For a moment, the plane seemed to fall silent, the hum of the engines the only sound. The businessman opened his mouth, perhaps to retaliate, but then closed it again, as if unsure of how to respond. Barron's words had landed with an unexpected impact. In that brief exchange, Barron had turned the tables. He had exposed the flaw in the businessman's thinking, the belief that power was only about dominance and control. And for a moment, Barron had shown him that true strength lay in influence, vision, and the ability to inspire others to think differently. The man shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the once confident aura around him now replaced with uncertainty. Barron's quiet demeanor, combined with his clarity of thought, had proven far more powerful than any boastful words. It was a subtle victory, one that didn't need to be declared loudly. Barron had simply spoken his truth, and in doing so, he had disrupted the businessman's entire worldview. As the conversation came to an awkward halt, Barron looked out the window again, allowing the silence to settle between them. The clouds had taken on a deeper, more reflective shade of grey, and Barron felt a sense of quiet triumph. He had turned the tables, not through aggression, but through a calm assertion of his own beliefs, and in doing so, he had shown the businessman something he had never expected to see: a glimpse of real power. The plane soared higher, cutting through the clouds, and for a brief moment, the world outside seemed to disappear. Barron Trump sat quietly by the window, his mind still processing the conversation with the businessman. The earlier tension had evaporated, leaving only the soft hum of the engines and the steady rhythm of the air conditioning. But something had shifted within him, a quiet realization, like the calm after a storm, that the real power in that conversation hadn't come from his words, but from his ability to remain grounded. The businessman, still sitting beside him, had grown quieter, more withdrawn. Barron could feel the man's confusion in the space between them. It wasn't hostility, but a kind of disorientation. He had been confronted with a perspective he hadn't expected, one that was neither flashy nor aggressive, but simple, direct, and unapologetically true. Barron's refusal to engage in the kind of power games the businessman had expected had left him rattled, and Barron recognized that what had unsettled the man wasn't just his views, it was his quiet confidence, the unspoken power that came from being at peace with one's own beliefs. Barron's whole life had been shaped by the presence of big personalities, larger-than-life figures in politics and business, each with their own version of success. He had watched his father, Donald Trump, navigate the world with a loud, brash confidence that commanded attention. Barron had grown up surrounded by this kind of power that demanded respect, power that dominated the room. Yet, as he grew older, he began to see that true strength didn't always have to be loud. Sometimes the most powerful moments were those that went unnoticed, the ones that passed quietly but left a lasting impact. In that moment, Barron understood something vital. The businessman's attempts to dominate the conversation, to assert his superiority, had only shown his weakness. His reliance on power, wealth, and influence as the ultimate measures of success had made him blind to the subtle forms of strength that didn't need to shout to be heard. Barron had known that the true power wasn't in dominating others, but in owning one's space, in having the confidence to speak the truth without fear of judgment. It was in being comfortable with silence, in letting the quiet confidence speak louder than words. The businessman shifted in his seat, looking out the window, his mind clearly still processing the exchange. Barron didn't need to say anything more. The realization had set in, and the man was beginning to see it too. Barron, though young, had shown him something that no amount of wealth or power could buy: a form of leadership rooted in humility, in self-assurance, and in the strength to let others have their say without feeling the need to overpower them. As the plane continued its journey through the sky, Barron felt a deep sense of peace. The quiet power he had just displayed was not one that could be seen in headlines or flashy news reports. It wouldn't be written about in books or spoken of in interviews. It was a power that didn't need validation from the outside world, one that didn't require applause or recognition. And in that moment, Barron realized that this was the kind of leader he wanted to be: not the loudest in the room, but the one who stood firm in his beliefs, unshaken by external noise. The businessman remained silent for the rest of the flight, and Barron didn't mind. He didn't need the man's approval. In fact, the silence felt more like a victory than any words of praise could have. The truth had been laid bare, and Barron knew that sometimes the most powerful moments are those where nothing is said at all. It was a quiet power, but one that spoke volumes. As the flight began its descent, the cabin slowly filled with the hum of seatbelt signs and the soft shuffle of passengers preparing to land. Barron Trump, still deep in thought, glanced out of the window. The vast expanse of the earth below felt so far away, yet the internal shift he had just experienced felt more profound than any of the miles they had traveled. The businessman, who had once been so eager to assert his dominance, was now quietly staring ahead, his expression unreadable. Barron's quiet confidence had done what no amount of brashness or words could have. It had disrupted the man's certainty, forcing him to reconsider his assumptions about power and success. The silence between them had become a space for reflection, a pause in which both of them could absorb the weight of the conversation or the lack thereof. Barron felt no need to fill the silence with words. He knew that the moment of realization had passed, and sometimes the most important lessons were those learned in stillness. As the plane touched down and the seatbelt sign blinked off, Barron stood up, gathered his belongings, and glanced at the businessman one last time. The man met his gaze briefly, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. It was a look that conveyed more than words ever could. A recognition, perhaps, of the quiet power Barron had displayed and the lesson he had inadvertently taught. For Barron, the experience had been a lesson in humility, one that he had never expected to come from a brief encounter in a cramped airplane cabin. It was easy to assume that power came from wealth or influence, from speaking louder or moving faster than anyone else. But Barron had realized that true strength was not always about dominating the room. It wasn't about commanding attention with grand gestures or boasting. True power lay in understanding one's own worth and not feeling the need to prove it to others. It was about standing firm in your beliefs, but also allowing space for others to do the same. It was the quiet strength that came from knowing when to speak and when to listen, when to act and when to remain still. As Barron walked down the aisle toward the exit, he thought back to his father, Donald Trump, and how his larger-than-life persona had shaped his own views on leadership. His father's public image was one of bravado, of relentless drive and the refusal to back down from a challenge. Yet Barron realized that he didn't have to follow in those exact footsteps to be a leader. Leadership could take many forms, and sometimes it was the ones who stood quietly in the background that left the most lasting impact. For the businessman, Barron knew that this encounter would be one he wouldn't soon forget. He had come into the conversation assuming that he could wield his experience and opinions like a weapon, trying to engage Barron in a battle of words. But Barron had never been interested in such a battle. He didn't need to assert dominance, because he understood that dominance didn't always win respect. Sometimes it was humility that did. As Barron stepped off the plane and into the bustle of the airport terminal, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. He didn't need anyone's approval, nor did he need to validate his existence through external measures of success. The real lesson was that humility, when wielded with quiet confidence, had its own kind of power. And that was a power that no one could take away.